Ja, men hej och välkomna till Aktiedagen här i Stockholm. Jag heter Jennifer Claesson och kommer att moderera kommande bolag. Och ni som sitter med oss får jättegärna ställa frågor till bolaget genom att smsa in en fråga eller skriva i livechatten på YouTube. And now I will switch to English because we will welcome SinterCast with the CEO Steve Dawson.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, good morning. Let me begin by introducing SinterCast. We are the industry leader for a new type of iron called compacted graphite iron. We're not a manufacturer, so we don't actually make the iron components. We provide the process control technology, the software and the service to enable the foundry industry to produce this material in a reliable and cost-effective way. CGI was first identified in 1948, but the first production wasn't until 50 years later with the introduction of our technology. So it's a difficult material to produce, and our technology enables the foundries to produce it in a reliable way, so there is less waste, less energy consumption, and therefore less CO2 emissions. CGI is stronger and harder and stiffer than the conventional iron, and so we can push engines harder to get more performance from smaller and lighter engines, so higher performance, better fuel economy, and again, lower CO2 emissions. Our first series production was in 1999 for Audi, and our first high-volume series production commitment was in 2003 for Ford. We had our first full-year profit in 2006. We gave our first dividend for the financial year 2010. And since we started our production, we've had more than 10% compounded annual growth rate. And we will also have double-digit growth in our future. As this is an investor forum, let's begin by discussing how we get paid. We have a recurring revenue from the production fee. So every time that a foundry ships a casting that was produced with our technology, they make a payment to SinterCast. We also have recurring revenue from the consumable sampling cup, which we supply exclusively. And I'd like to put that in perspective. Excuse me. Today, our customers are using more than 200,000 sampling cups per year. It means that every 2.5 minutes, someone is taking a SinterCast sample. During this 25-minute presentation, we will have 10 samples. It means 10 pots or 10 ladles of iron, which will be approximately 10 tons. And considering our average casting size, it's about 60 engines. Yeah, so 60 engines in just under half an hour. It means that every 30 seconds, somewhere in the world, a new vehicle is rolling off a manufacturing line with a SinterCast engine in it. Yeah, so the technology is mature, it's proven, and it satisfies every definition of high volume. And we also sell or lease the hardware, and here you can see pictures of our standard equipment. And we have an annual software license fee for the use of our software, so it's another source of recurring revenue. And like all companies, we provide technical service and spare parts and a lot of support, particularly for new customers, to establish an efficient process and to begin to produce CGI. And 90%, more than 90% of our revenue is recurring from the production fee, the exclusive supply of the consumables, and the annual software license. So let me give a visual reference for our technology. And here you can see our sampling module. So the operator puts the sampling cup onto the bottom of the sampling module. And he then takes a spoon of iron from the ladle. It's about a 1-ton ladle. He lifts it over our sampling cup for 2 or 3 seconds. And now we have a golf ball sized amount of iron in that sampling cup. And we allow it to freeze. And as it solidifies, we make our analysis. At the end of our analysis, which takes about 3 minutes, we have the opportunity to adjust or to correct that pot of iron before the foundry makes castings, so that they have an upfront confidence that everything they produce is in specification. And I'd also like to put this in perspective. On average, there are 3 things that we can add to the ladle to correct it. And the main ingredient is magnesium. And on average, our addition is about 35 grams of magnesium per ton. So we're really manipulating and controlling the 4th decimal point. We are bringing pharmaceutical levels of precision measurement and control to this hostile foundry environment where the iron is at 1,500 degrees Celsius. Yeah, and that's what enables the reliable production of this new material. So with that as background, let's look now at what we have achieved. So I mentioned earlier, through our production history, we've had double-digit production growth. So this is showing the last 15 years. Of course, there's some bumps in the road. As ever, we had the 2008-9 economic crisis. You see in 2020 this sharp shock from the COVID shutdowns. But overall, it's more or less been a straight line growth. And in fact, we have had 13% compounded annual growth over the last 15 years. And last year, from 2021 to 2022, we also had 13% growth. Yeah? And we'll talk a little bit later about 2023 in our outlook. Each time we make a casting, we receive a payment. And therefore, if we have double-digit increase in our production volume, we also have double-digit growth in our revenue. You can see that there's some variation in that plot. 2019, we had a record year for installation revenue with 20 million crowns, so it's a little bit higher. But generally speaking, there's a 1-to-1 correlation between the production volume and the revenue. And at the half-year point this year, we had 58 million crowns in revenue, and we have 29 people. As I said, we're not a manufacturer, we're just a service provider. And so if we were to double that 58 million crowns for full year and divide that by our people, we have revenue of 4 million crowns per employee. And with our 30% profit margin, we have a profit of approximately 0.9 million per employee. Yeah, and I'll come back to the first half of the year earlier. It was a bit of a slow start for us, and so surely in the second half of the year will be much better than double. We'll beat those numbers. We'll beat them clearly. We are a dividend company. We have an aggressive approach to the dividend. So when we have this double-digit growth in the production and in the revenue, we also have a double-digit growth in our revenue. And indeed, since we gave our first dividend in 2011 for the financial year 2010, we've had a 22% compounded annual growth in our dividend. And over the same period, we have given 111% of our operating result back to the shareholders, and that corresponds to 282 million crowns. So today, we have had 13 consecutive years of increasing dividend, and our immediate goal is to extend that to 25 years of continuous increase in our dividend. Let's now look at current year with that as our background. As I mentioned, we had a little bit of a slow start to the year. In the second half of last year, we were running at about 3.5 million engine equivalents. And you can see in the first 4 months of the year, we averaged 3.3 million. We know why. A couple of our high volume programs were going through model year changeovers, so the manufacturing was lower. That has come back since June. And over the last 4 months, we've averaged 4 million engine equivalents. And that's really impressive because that's also through the summer shutdown period. We're normally lower in July and August. And this year, July and August were 11% higher than last year. So year to date, we are 3.65 million engine equivalents. Last year, in January to August, we were 3.49, so it's just over 4% increase. But as I said earlier, we'll be much stronger in the second half. Already, the second 4 quarters at 4 million were 17% higher than the first group of 4 months. That will continue and grow during the last 4 months of the year. So we'll get close to double-digit growth this year. It's tough to get all the way to 10%, but I think we'll get close. It will certainly be a good marker to maintain our compounded annual growth rate in double digits. September to December last year averaged 3.55 million engine equivalents. I think that this year will be well above 4. So as I say, we'll make a lot of growth on that 4% year-on-year growth and hopefully get it close to 10 by the end of the year. Let's also look at the type of vehicles that the SinterCast technology is used in. During the first half of the year, 51% of our production was for commercial vehicle. 28% was for the very large pickups, the so-called Super Duty pickups used primarily in North America. 12% was for full-size pickup. Think the Ford F-150, the most popular vehicle in America for the last 40 years. It's been the best-selling vehicle in North America. We are 5% a mid-size pickup and SUV. It's the Ford Ranger, the Volkswagen Amarok, and some other SUVs. And we're about 4% off-road. It is rail, marine, agriculture, and construction. So while we're on this overhead, and the point in this overhead is we don't make cars. Yeah, all of our stuff is big. We're not exposed to the car market. There's a lot of discussion about electrification in vehicles, and that's not something that applies directly or immediately to SinterCast. So while we're on this overhead, let's take a minute to look at each of those sectors and to comment on the longer range outlook. Today, commercial vehicles are 96.3% diesel in Europe, 99.1% diesel in North America. Those are our 2 main markets currently. And of that, about 30% of the new engines are currently made in CGI. Yeah? It is forecast that that number will become something like 80% over the next 5 years. So we have a very strong growth opportunity in commercial vehicle. Commercial vehicle is certainly longer timeline than passenger vehicles for alternative technologies. But even if there is some inroads of alternative, alternative technologies, as the current diesel engines change from gray iron, change from conventional gray iron to CGI, we have a huge growth opportunity. Super Duty pickups, the president of Ford for the last 2 years have said that electrification doesn't apply to these vehicles. When you're towing things, the driving range decreases dramatically. It just doesn't suit the duty cycle of the Super Duty. And General Motors, over the last year and a half, have announced $4.6 billion of investment in new engines for these vehicles, which will carry them for the long term. The Ford F-150, our engine, there are 5 engine options in Ford F-150. Ours is the smallest and the lightest and the most fuel efficient. And therefore, it's logical that it also has the longest timeline. We have always been the base engine on the mid-level, trim level of the vehicle. And just last week, Ford announced that our engine will now be the base engine on the entry-level models as well. So that will increase our volume. And what I did, I went to the US EPA website last week when they made the announcement. And on the EPA website, for any vehicle that's sold in America, you can download the fuel economy statistics. So on the left, it's our engine, the 2.7 liter V6 petrol engine. And on the right is the engine that is currently the base engine on the entry-level models, the 3.3 liter petrol engine. And you can see that we have a 0.5 liter per 100 kilometer fuel economy advantage. So for the average driving distance of the F-150 in America, That means 95 liters of fuel saved every year. And we're currently making about 300,000 vehicles or engines for F-150 every year. And the average life of an F-150 is 14 years. So if you do that math, it works out to 1 million tons of CO2 saved over the life of the vehicles. Yeah? And we will make that contribution every year, year on year. I've also added something to this overhead in the bottom to compare the two engines. So you see that our engine with 2.7 liters and the current entry-level base engine at 3.3, we are 18% smaller. And we also have 12% higher horsepower and 51% higher torque. And torque is what you drive, right? Torque is the acceleration, torque is the pulling power. And this is the real concrete example of CGI making smaller engines that are more powerful and yet more fuel efficient. So smaller, lighter, stronger, better, cleaner. And so that is our fuel save contribution on F-150. We can do the same thing with the commercial vehicles and the Super Duty vehicles. So this now represents 90% of our production. Yeah, and we can do the same thing because all of our engines are stronger and provide better performance and better fuel economy. So OEMs in the commercial vehicle sector, when they use a SinterCast CGI engine, they say that they save approximately 8% of fuel. And you can go through the math. It's on our website. It's in our annual report. I don't want to go into the detail here. But again, if you consider the average driving distance, the fuel consumption, and the years of use of that vehicle, for commercial vehicles, with our current production of something between 175,000 and 200,000 commercial vehicles per year, it saves more than 1 million tons of CO2. In the Super Duty sector, for all of those vehicles, there are two engine options, ours and one other. And it's well documented that for the average driver in the US, our engine saves approximately 1,000 liters of fuel per year. And we're making more than 1,000 of those vehicles every day. So again, when you do the math, recognizing that burning every liter of fuel generates 2.5 kilograms of CO2, we save more than 1 million tons of CO2 per year. So compiling it all together, we don't just make the saving in the year that we make the vehicle. That vehicle stays on the road for 10 or 20 years, and every year it makes those savings. So the engines that we made 15 years ago and 10 years ago, they're still on the road, still contributing. And so we calculate that last year in 2022, our technology contributed to the saving of 8 million tons of CO2. And since we started our high volume production in 2003, that number is 50 million tons. So let me put that in perspective. And this is now from the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. It's available on their website. You can see the CO2 from the entire transportation sector. We've ticked all of the boxes to show the total. And in 2022, it was 13.6 million tons of CO2. That's everything from motorcycles to locomotives. Yeah? And with the Swedish CO2 emissions decreasing, and with our production increasing, within a couple of years, we will soon match the entire CO2 generation from the Swedish transportation sector. It's the same as taking every vehicle, everything from a motorcycle to a train, and taking it off the road for a full year. And we will do that every year. So, in summary, we've now had 9 consecutive quarters of year-on-year growth with the very strong July and August. It's clear that again in the third quarter we'll have year-on-year growth. We were a little bit low in the fourth quarter last year and also in the first quarter, so I'm sure that will stretch to 12 consecutive quarters. We foresee continued double-digit growth through 2030. with high volume production to 2035 and beyond. And that's just considering the Western market. There will also be growth and demand for efficient engines in the developing world. We're already making engines for Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America for mid-size pickups. Currently, our operating margin is about 30%. We plan to increase that to more than 40% in 2028. Unless inflation goes really silly, we forecast that our operating cost in 2028 will not be more than it is this year in 2023. So both on the revenue side and on the cost side, we will increase the operating margin. We intend to be one of the most profitable companies in the Nordic region. We currently are. We intend to continue. As I mentioned earlier, we now have 13 years of increasing dividend. There is a category called dividend aristocrat when you achieve 25 consecutive years of increasing dividend, and that is our next goal for the dividend. And today we're sitting at something like 50 million tons of CO2 cumulative contribution, and we intend to increase that to 100 million before 2028. So it's a really good story. It's a great technology. It's a great company with a good future and a really good contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for the presentation.
Thank you.
I'll start off with a question for you.
Yes, you may.
Yes. Would you like to tell us more about you, your background, and how you became the CEO of SinterCast?
I can tell you that story, yes. So I'm a Canadian. I did my university education in Canada. I graduated with my PhD in metallurgical engineering, working with liquid iron back in 1989. At that time, I was recruited into the US steel industry. I worked a few years there. I really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating industry. And in those years, SinterCast was moving from Sweden to North America. And at that time, they reasoned that the automotive industry was the end customer. And so they decided to go and set up in Detroit. And when they got there, they looked for local people to recruit. They brought some Swedish people with them, but they also had to recruit locally. So in November of 91, I was recruited as technical director. It was a fascinating time because at that time, SinterCast was an idea. It wasn't a product. So we took the ideas of the professor and turned them into a technology and into a product that we could install in the foundries and carry his ideas. So we marketed it to the foundries. As I mentioned, CGI was first identified in 1948, and people had tried to make it in the 50s and in the 70s and the 80s, and they failed. So all of the foundries just knew that CGI wasn't possible. And our job was to convince them that with our help it was. So that was a fascinating thing. And in parallel, we had to go out to the car and truck companies and explain to them how they could benefit from this material. So it was a really fascinating time. I was lucky to be the technical director of the company during those formative years. In 2002, I became CEO.
Thank you for that. And I think we only have time for one more question. And this question from the audience aligns with my question about the current United Auto Workers strike. So the question is, how are you affected by the ongoing strike? And could you tell us about the strike?
Yeah. So for a long time, the end of the current agreement was 14 September. So it was just last week. Usually the United Auto Workers choose one of the Detroit three, Ford, General Motors, or Stellantis, to strike against. This year, unprecedented, they've chose all three. They have quite ambitious demands. Let me just say a few things about the strike. First, from the workers' point of view. In America, the UAW makes an agreement every 4 years. Their last one was before COVID. A lot has changed. There's been inflation. They don't have a cost of living allowance. So it's perfectly reasonable that they ask for an increase. Also in those years, the automotive companies have been fantastically profitable, and it's right that they should get a share of that. So that's the worker perspective. For the Detroit 3, they pay their auto workers about $65 per hour. The transplant companies, Toyota, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans who make cars in the US, they average about $50 per hour. Tesla pays their employees $45 per hour. So already the Detroit Three pay a lot. And then from the economy, automotive sector in the United States is 0.7% of the economy. The Detroit Three are 0.4, so it's not going to affect the economy. It will affect it locally in Michigan and so on, but it won't affect the macro economy in America. So now the two sides have to find an agreement. I saw just yesterday that the union backed off. They wanted a $40 increase from 65 to 105. They backed that off by $4. The auto workers, the OEMs are offering $20, so they're not far apart. It should be doable. There's some other demands that are very difficult. They're asking for a return of pension, which had been transferred to the union. They're asking for a return of lifetime health care, which had been transferred to the union. And they're asking for a 4-day work week, and that's surely not going to happen. So there is, it's an ongoing discussion. They started.
We're running out of time.
They started the strike on the 14th at midnight. They chose one factory of each of the three, but they didn't choose the high volume vehicles. So I think the union's also trying to be sensible. I think we get a resolution.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Steve.
Yeah.
A round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.